I had only been on the department for a little over a year when I got the bank alarm call. I was working night shift, and it was early Saturday morning when the alarm came out. I rolled on the alarm. The bank was one of those drive-up only places that had 3 lanes and an ATM with a little building where the tellers would sit inside. The full bank was a half a block away. I wasn't expecting anything. False alarms were not uncommon. I parked across the street and walked up to the bank. Everything looked secure from the front. I made my way around the side, and that's when I saw the guy. He was in his early 50s, and he was sitting in the landscaping next to the building. He was sweating badly, and his face was red. He looked like he'd just run a couple of miles. His feet were shoved into a pair of tennis shoes with no socks. The socks were on his hands. There was a crowbar on the ground next to him. When I walked up, he said breathlessly, "You got me." It only took a few minutes to figure out that he'd been trying to pry open the back door of the bank. He was placed into handcuffs and transported to the department. I gathered the evidence and took some pictures. I then made my way to the PD to interview the guy. He was frustrating. He wouldn't say much, just sit there and grunt. I tried to get him to talk about his day, what he'd been doing, and how he'd ended up next to the bank. His responses were shrugs or barely comprehensible words. I gave him the whole, "Now's your chance to come clean and let the judges know you were cooperative," but that didn't seem to have any effect. Finally, I decided to shake him up a little. "I'm going to process the bank and pull your fingerprints off that crowbar and the bank door. And when I'm done, you're going to go away for attempted burglary. You understand that?" A big smile crossed his face, and he leaned back in his chair. "You won't find my fingerprints on anything," he said. And that's when I realized I'd screwed it all up. He had his socks on his hands, so no fingerprints. And now that he had that to hold on to, he wasn't ever going to say anything else. It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. A few months later, I attended my first in-service training class with the agency. Interview and Interrogation, taught by a guy named Stan Walters. I learned a lot from Stan. Stan Walters has spent more than 40 years studying and researching the science of interview and interrogation. He's the author of Principles of Kinesic Interview and Interrogation, 2nd edition, and The Truth About Lying, How to Spot a Lie and Protect Yourself from Deception, which has been published in 7 foreign languages. He's authored numerous interview and interrogation training guides, audio programs, and videos, including 145 plus videos on his YouTube channel. Stan has regularly appeared on Crime Watch Daily with Chris Hansen. He's also appeared on ABC, CBS, CNN, Fox News, Fox & Friends, NBC, French Channel 1, and Australia Today. He's been profiled twice on National Geographic and was host and technical advisor on the National Geographic special, The Science of Interrogation. Stan was nice enough to sit down and spend some time talking to me about interviews and interrogations. Stan, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Hey, I'm glad we got to be with you.
As when we started talking, you had always been on a short list of someone I wanted to talk to because early in my law enforcement career, you were one of the first classes I went through. And I can't stress to anyone listening how much I learned in such a short period of time talking about interviews and interrogations of suspects.
I appreciate that. Appreciate the comment. And then I try to, and you do the same thing. I try to teach and train the same way I would enjoy teaching and training. And if the student's not engaged, and you're probably just like me, I enjoy that one student that's sitting in the back with his arms crossed. I'm thinking, boy, I'm not getting through to this guy. And then they come up at the end of the class and they say, "I've been a cop for 35 years. Where the hell were you 34 years ago when I needed this?" Then you want them over.
I love to change their attitudes or ideas when they come out of a class to feel very different than when they went in, whether that's through motivation or through training or providing them with a new skill set. I love doing that.
Love to change, see people change and grow and improve themselves and get excited about what they work on too.
Now, how did you get involved in training?
By nature, my dad was a Southern Baptist minister and he was a school teacher, so I didn't have a chance. But I enjoyed the training, enjoyed the interaction. I had no problem standing in front of audiences and so forth as a kid in church and that kind of stuff. And I was working as director of security for a $500 million bank. And one of the requirements is that under the Bank Protection Act of 1968, bank employees have to be trained on an annual basis about security procedures and so forth. And I would add in things like, oh, here's how we beat the counterfeiting, ask for ID, what do you do for safety deposit box security, and so forth. And enjoyed that a lot. One of the things, though, that in my job, nobody really explained to my satisfaction about interviewing. And I was interviewing employees and customers and subjects in counterfeiting or bank robbery and that kind of stuff. And there was no central theme. So I just began researching and digging and took a class on behavior symptoms and so forth and got hooked on it and just kept researching and studying. And our friend, mutual friend Jim Alsop, somebody connected the two of us and began training with Jim. I think it was about 86, 87, something like that. But I've been doing training of some form for 40 years and always looking to improve. And so the interviewing became the thing I loved the most because of the conversation going on. And dug into the research, enjoyed teaching the classes, and then kept looking, how can I take it to the next level? How can I improve it from here? Because you, from back history and from the officers you've been in training, interview and interrogation is one of those guys, they would rather eat glass than sit in a room for that. And I was determined to change that type of attitude in training on interview and interrogation. Because from the day the patrol officer hits the street until 35 years later, they die of a heart attack in front of the ESPN, winding the gold watch you got at retirement. That's all law enforcement does. Criminal investigators from patrol all the way up. We engage people.
Yeah, I've always said that I think
information.
one of the most beneficial tools you have at your disposal is your ability to communicate with someone. You can learn so much, do so much. And the other thing is watching them, because I think it was the big thing I learned from your class is looking for those signs that before your class I was ignoring. I wasn't watching or looking. I was just talking.
And it is interesting that those signs, I've got a webinar coming up soon with Jim about LLRMI, verbal cues versus body language cues, and why do we miss the signs of deception, and what's the truth about some of that. And so we've advanced even more in reading those cues, reducing the workload for the interviewer and improving the engagement in the conversation and paying attention more to the individual. And how do we get more information from that person? And the spot deal I wanted to share with you that you'd find interesting. I was asked to review and look at a case of this guy who was thought to be killing women. And his particular activity was very sexual, sadistic behavior. And believe it at that. But it was one of those things when you look at it, so he didn't start this yesterday. This is a long fantasy. And I suggested, guys, do we know somebody that was dating him before he did his first killing? Tracked the woman down. She's now married. Was engaged to him. She broke it off. She's got a kid. When she broke it off, he got arrested at her apartment. And so I thought, okay, I'll start with that and maybe get into the sensitive stuff of this married woman, right? Long story short, I asked her a few questions and she told me about him getting arrested, and she made a comment about stumbling down the hallway, locking the door, locking him out when he went out to argue with a record driver towing his car. And twice she told me about stumbling down the hall, and I'm thinking, he got her drunk or he's roofied her. So I asked her, were you all drinking for dinner? And she said, well, a couple glasses of wine. I said, well, did it go to your head or something? She said, no. And I said, you said you were stumbling down the hall. What were you doing in the bedroom? And she told me what they were doing. Homicide guy sitting beside me is stunned. And he said, this lady said, we've talked to you several times. You've never told us that before. And this is what stuck with me. She said, I didn't know it was important, and you didn't ask me. That's on the interviewer. And how do you know, if you don't know what's there, how do you find what's not there, if that makes sense?
Well, it absolutely does. And you also said something there in that description, that another thing that I think is really important that I'd like you to elaborate on, and that is that difference between deception, those people trying to lie to you, and that evasion, that maybe they don't want to say something for a wide variety of reasons.
Sure. And when you look at deception, the deliberate effort, there's two kinds. There's omission, where you lie by leaving certain things out and people draw the wrong conclusion, or the embellishment. I had two separate classes ahead. One guy claimed he was Delta Force, another guy claimed he was a Navy SEAL. And after a couple of questions, it became apparent both of them were embellishing their background. So that one's fairly easy. The most common form of deception is leaving something out, the omission part. And you draw, as the interviewer, you draw the wrong conclusion from that. Interestingly, though, and this prelude will fit what I'm going to describe. You remember Woody Hayes from Ohio State football
Absolutely.
coach, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And I know the Michigan fans, everybody on here now is going to start booing, but
They'll be start chanting Bo Schembechler.
there you go. But he said there's three things that happen with a forward pass during a game. Two of them are bad. It can be intercepted, bad. It can be dropped, bad, or it can be a complete pass. I started thinking, what we forget as interviewers or as an officer in a first call, first response to domestic or whatever. And I was listening to one of your podcasts to get a feel for your program, and you were talking about de-escalation training. And I said, when you show up, we have an impact on that situation as the interviewer, as the officer. We're not in a vacuum. We're not invisible force. And there's three things that are going to happen with the interviewer. The interviewer can complicate the process, make it hard for victims and witnesses who do want to cooperate, but we keep them from doing it by the way we fire off questions and interview them. And often they hold stuff back because you're not asking for it or they don't feel comfortable telling you because you're driving the interview instead of let them converse.
So I had one of my detectives that I supervised at one point in time. He had a real problem in his interviews is he would never shut up. He literally would I would listen to him talk for 30 minutes before he even got to the first question. Yeah. I figured most people that did confess to him did it out of being just tired. They just wanted this over. Because I was, whenever I listened to it. Do you find that sometimes different techniques work for weird reasons?
Yeah. And that's the other part is adapting to the individual you're talking to, knowing a little bit something about them or picking up on part of the conversation that's significant to them and make that connection. I worked with a friend of mine, Randy Merriman, on combat hunter training, which is the Marine program of tracking and so forth. It's been translated to law enforcement. And one of the things that we talk about in the tracking, you put yourself in the person's mindset. And you have to think like them and what is driving them. So I was helping in selecting some instructors, guys who had previous experience in the Marine Corps. And one potential instructor made the comment about, yeah, I used it that one time when that guy walked in front of our patrol. And he just kept on. I said, wait a minute. That came up. That was important. And I took him back and said, tell me about how you used this training, how it helped that time you just told me about being on patrol. And all of a sudden, this brilliant story came out. But what was a passing comment, he thought, caught my attention. And going back and following up, I got this great story. This guy had a jerry can, walked in front of patrol, and they had several suicide bombers that attacked units like that. And his guy up on the top of the Humvee racked in around. He was going to open up, and the guy said, hold on, wait. He said, I could tell when the guy looked at us, he was startled. He wasn't paying attention. He was in another world thinking and just walked out in front of our patrol. And one guy was ready to cut him down, but I could see there was a difference in his behavior and stopped my guy from firing on him. So those phrases, like you said, with your guy that just wouldn't stop talking, that's the complication. If you let them talk, you keep them engaged, they think what they're saying is important, and you give value to their point of view as the victim or the witness as well as the suspect. So you're correct. One of the complicating things is knowing as the interviewer when to wait. And sometimes a pregnant pause, you get lots of information.
There was a television show that I watched, and I can't remember the one, but the interviewer, it was just, I loved it because, I'm sure they got this from someone with experience, because the interviewer walked in and sat down across from the person they were going to interview and said absolutely nothing and just stared at them. And the longer they stared, the more the other person kept talking. And oftentimes I've found that kind of works because people hate that dead space. They hate dead air. They want to fill it with something.
And one of the things that I talk about in class, a good comedian has timing. He tells a joke, then he waits a beat or two for the audience to get the joke to laugh. If he fires off the next joke too quickly, he does what's called he steps on the punchline. And the audience gets discouraged because they're not engaged in the storytelling. So a pause, just like you said, is a terrific tool. Wait 3 to 4 seconds, almost a little bit of an uncomfortable beat. And it's amazing the dialogue continues. They feel they got to fill that space up with their explanation.
We also hear that in music as well. People talk about learning to play, leaving space open within music so that the actual song comes out as opposed to filling it with sound.
Yep, exactly.
Now, a lot of these interviews then, it requires you to make a connection with the person you're interviewing. And that can be really difficult based on who you're interviewing. How do you go about doing that?
Good point. One of the things I talk about in class is we have the assumption that bad guys don't want to talk, they're going to lie to you, and you got to manipulate it out of them. And there was Dr. Ray Bull. He's over in England. He's now in Australia, but he would take PhD candidates who were cops. He sent them to 4 different countries. Now, if I remember correctly, Canada, South Africa, England, and I think the one was in U.S., I remember. And they interviewed inmates who had been convicted. They pulled their records. They knew the whole case, the forensics, everything. And they asked them, when you were interviewed, what was your plan when you came in? Were you going to talk to them? Did you rehearse a lie? What did you do? And only 15% from 4 different countries, 4 different studies, 8 years apart, only 15% said they actually rehearsed a lie that we're going to tell. When they were asked, under what conditions would you talk? And they said 2 things. Number 1, if they would treat me with respect and listen to me. These are the bad guys. There was 51% had no plan. Then they came in, they're going to wing it, and asked, when would you have talked? They said, if they would treat me with respect and listen to me. So you don't have to get on the floor and have a primal scream with the subject. You just respect the other individual, no matter, and you can't pass judgment on them. You're not there to convert them. I don't know why. One just jumped in my head. Why do we get mad when a suspect lies to us? What did we think was going to happen? You know, that would be like a barber coming home from work and his wife says, honey, how'd it go today? I said, geez, everybody came in for a haircut. What did you expect to happen when you walked into the room?
I have to admit, having that same problem, because oftentimes I found myself really respecting the guy that said, I'm not going to talk to you. I want my attorney. And then they just sat there quietly. I was like, thank you. Finally, somebody's not wasting my time.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
But I found myself struggling with those people that I felt like wanted to waste my time. But there's a lot of good information you can draw out of that if you could be patient during that interview.
Very much. Yeah. And I used to think of the way my dad would preach and the way he would counsel people. And me as a kid, him being a teacher, former teacher and a pastor, he could get in my head in a heartbeat. And then there's the question, do you want the butt beating or do you want the sermon? Just beat my butt. At least get me over with.
Just get it over with.
But the sermon would stick with you. And so of investigators and the data that I'm seeing, 1/3 should never be allowed near an interview room. 1/3 are adequate, and about 1/3 are really good at it. But it is a skill you can develop, and you can fine tune, and it's just a listening skill, and then methodically picking. It's not the questions that you ask. And that's what you and I talked about way back then when we had class together. It's finding the right topics to engage conversation, ask questions about.
And I still specifically remember you talking about how just because they're lying to you on a topic doesn't necessarily mean that they've done it. It means they're uncomfortable about talking about it. Dig into that, them being uncomfortable. And that's where you need to focus and not just assume, they did it because of this.
Right.
No, they're just really uncomfortable about that. And you need to figure out why.
And something we've advanced, I think since the time we've been together, is paying attention to feedback from the person. And I classified into 5 easy categories: anger, depression, denial, bargaining, and acceptance. Anger and depression are very emotional. And people with real strong emotions, they're not listening to you. Their brain is turned off. They're on an emotional side. So you might be saying the right things, but they're not hearing you mentally, cognitively.
And do you see those same problems with the interrogator, with the interviewer?
Yeah. If an interviewer gets pulled in, one of my students went through all through the advanced class. He would send me tapes all the time, and he's talking to a guy named Jerry, and Jerry's telling the truth about the shooting. Now, Billy is there to talk about the stolen diamond ring, but he thought, I'll start with the shooting. They start arguing back and forth. Billy wants Jerry to say he was wrong for what happened. He dropped the gun. It was an accidental discharge, but he's going to whip the guy's butt anyway. And then Jerry said, no, you're doing the same thing. And they argue 45 minutes, never get to the target topic because the interviewer's angry and he's not listening. And the subject's angry and he's not listening. And they just fight back and forth. They gain no ground at all. So recognizing that, what's my best tool to diffuse anger or deal with a person's depression, spot denial, etc.? And so it's paying more. Then you get back to what you talk about, engaging that, building rapport. That strengthens that rapport between you and whatever the position that subject is, victim, witness, or suspect.
Now, you've had a lot of experience interviewing the bad guys, and even part of your classes is taking students into the prisons and interviewing some really bad guys. How did you develop that? How did you start down that path? And what are some of the outcomes you've seen from that type of training?
And when listening to one of your podcasts, you're talking about, for example, firearms training, creating a realistic situation. So way early on, maybe I think it was 88, something like that. I had been interviewing. It was just, I wanted to talk to the most evil person I could talk to. I wanted to feel what it was like to be in a room with somebody that evil. And got the chance to sit down to talk to a serial killer. He'd already been convicted, but I want to know how he thought. A serial killer named Donald Harvey, who had murdered patients in hospitals, and spent about 6 hours with him. And when I came out of that, I had this experience. This is what students need to do. They need to, and if you fail in that interview, in that practice session, nothing bad's going to happen. You'll learn from it. So I started working with a guy at the time, was my contact, Dr. Brett Scott at Eastern Kentucky University, the College of Law Enforcement. He'd been director of corrections. And I proposed, could we do this? He said, well, sure. So I started taking students to prisons. And there'd be 5 teams and 5 inmates. And I tell the inmate, they don't know what your crime is. You can lie or tell the truth. If you lie, don't let them catch you, because if they catch you, they instantly pass the class. If you tell the truth, you're going to have them convinced. And so for the students, 2 would interview and 3 would sit back and watch. And then at the conclusion of 45 minutes, I now have the 3 students who are watching, they'll debrief the 2 interviewers. And now they can't say, well, you did this wrong. No, don't tell me I did something wrong unless you give me a solution or a better option. So the way they feedback, on this spot that you had a problem here, what might work better, try this. Then the inmate gives them feedback. And for example, there was a guy who was molesting kids. And when he got done this segment, he looked at one interviewer and says, I could tell you didn't like me. I could tell the look on your face. That's why I didn't even talk to you or look at you. That's why I talked to him, because he was patient with me. And that's the feedback, right? So that live fire, if you will, situation, it changes you after sitting there and listening to why some guy shot the cop, or the guy that killed his lover, or the guy who was rustling pigs was one of them. We even had a Syrian fighter pilot in a class in Texas and flew 2 MiGs. And interesting to talk to him. He had been involved in fraud involving sales of high-end cars. And we took him later, Randy and I, and we talked him off camera and talked about what went on at Benghazi, which was a fascinating conversation. But to be in that setting, and actually I've got to get, with nothing in my hands, no information, just like I'd be on the street. I walked into it cold. What can I get out of this person in 45 minutes? Then go back. Then the teams, so we videotape all that. So team 1 would watch team 5's tapes. 2 would watch 1, 3 watch 2, 4 watch 3, 5 watch 4. Because you've already interviewed the guy. Right. How about watching the other team interview the same inmate you did? What did they do different?
Do you see a lot of differences between the 2 interviews?
Yes, both the inmate and in the interviewers. And because of what I do, I mix the teams up. For example, on one team, I've trained the National Security Agency for 23 years now. I had an NSA spook. I had an intel guy from Fort Carson, 4th Infantry, Sergeant Paul Brooks. had assistant director of security for Pfizer Pharmaceutical out of New York, homicide investigator for Lexington, Kentucky Metro PD, and a child abuse investigator from upstate New York. They're on a team.
That's an interesting
Think of
team.
the different disciplines there. So the intel guy watches a corporate guy interview. A corporate guy watches a child abuse investigator, how she would talk to somebody. And so it's kind of like cross-pollination, and you pick up other skills. So you get out of your own zone and say, hey, there's a broader range that I can use here. And I've done that I've been in 37 prisons. Wait, I have visited 37 prisons. I have to be careful.
That's a whole different story if you've been in 37.
Right? In, let's see, 37 states and one foreign country. Last one I did, we got clearance through the Pentagon and took a class from Army CID instructors, and we went to Fort Leavenworth, the military detention barracks, and spent the day. And now these are the instructors, and they love the devil out of it. And so they began to deploy the same concepts that they could at the Army CID school down at Fort Leonard Wood in inner training sessions. So that's my favorite course, because you get everything. And you hear some of the most fantastic stories. And sometimes the guys tell you the truth. Here's what I was thinking. This is what was on my mind. I never thought about so-and-so. That's all that catalog in your head the next time you sit down and interview somebody. So it makes a better interviewer.
Now, you've got a tremendous amount of experience with these interviewing techniques. You've written books on these interviewing techniques and have trained all over the world with these techniques. And one of the things that we've discussed in the past that I think is very interesting to me is there are other methods and techniques out there. They tend to grab onto something, and while one works and proven, another one doesn't quite work as well. Yet agencies will go back to that thing that doesn't work instead of focusing on the one that is proven and does work. Why is that?
I've asked it all times with agencies, in particular if they've got in lawsuits. And why are you going back to the same place you've gotten sued for? You're losing cases. And it's the most discouraging answer. And it was, quote, that's the way we've always done it.
Makes
and
you
I'm
cringe.
so tempted to ask them, okay, so what type of weapon handgun officers carry now? Revolver or automatic? What's an automatic? Now, we could save a whole lot of budget money if we got rid of all these digital radio systems and so forth. Let's just go back to call boxes on the corner of the street and everybody's got a key. Wouldn't that save money? That's the same meaning when you tell me that's the way we've always done it. And so training, whether it's the de-escalation, whether it's the way we deal with gangs, whether it's we deal with school security, whether it's active shooter, if we don't learn and progress, we're stuck back. I just pulled up a case before we came on together that I'd advised on. And Steve, this was really discouraging. It's a huge, big agency. It's double homicide. And there was 15 investigators who conducted 23 interviews. Every interview all of them made exactly the same interviewing mistakes in every single one of the interviews. This just stunned me. The sergeant in homicide, not once, but 3 times, interviewed witnesses as a group in the room together.
No, that's not right.
How could you miss that? So in my comment in some of my advice was, the reason all these guys are making the same mistake because they're all trained inadequately the same way. Some of the tactics you're using, I can document that are from back in 1994. You have not progressed your training to the current level, the current forensic standard that the courts are looking for. And to me, and you being on the administrative side, have seen this more. I think the administrators in our training groups need to be as researching and as forward-thinking as they possibly can. While we use this again, is there another reiteration? For example, I've got a Chevy Avalanche. It's a 2010. Okay, it's paid off. They're going to bury me in it. I just got a notice from them that it has 2G networking on my OnStar thing. And it's going to go, they're just going to phase it out in December. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, I know what I've done, my hands free and so forth. I'm in a 5G world using 2G equipment. So our administrators need to think we need to be catching up with the 5G, which requires don't look at what you've already done. What's the next 3G, 4G, 5G?
I think that's a very important point. I think that as administrators, or even as trainers, even as a trainer, looking at what's coming up and what's out there and what's new and where our changes, but also without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Some of that old stuff works because it works, and we don't want to get rid of the stuff that works, but we do want to make the advances that we need to make and stop being stuck in the 19th and 20th centuries and look at what our opportunities are. Like you talked about the call box key. They gave me one when I hired on my police department. Now, we didn't even have call boxes then, but I still got a call box key. It was part of the initial gear equipment that they gave you, even though we didn't have them anymore. And I was always wondered, why do I have this key? Because that's the way we've always done it.
I bingo. And then the thing you also with the trainer that you just touched on, as an instructor, my job is to do the digging, the research, and make sure that I am current in what I present and work on my presentation skills to keep my audience engaged. Because that's the two goals. You might have a great topic, but if you don't have the officers and your audience engaged in it, and they're quickly going to tune you out.
Help your team rise to increasing expectations with Agency 360's cloud-based software. Whether it is for the training of new employees or annual performance evaluations, Agency 360 can help trainers and supervisors streamline documentation, create consistency, and communicate clearly. Help retention by setting the tone and culture early with Agency 360. Learn more at agency360.com. That's AGENCY360.com.
Now, you've trained for such a very long time. Have you seen let me back up. What kind of differences have you seen between the people you're training, but with your audience? How have they changed over the years?
With the young folks now, they're very connected, internet connected and digitally and so forth. And so we're reaching them through that, and because of budgets and so forth, we're reaching them for virtual training. But I've seen their attention span is divided. I'm not blaming them, but we just have so much noise coming in that it's sometimes you got to get their attention back. And so when you have that mixed group, I got a 25-year veteran, I got a 6-year officer, and I've got two universes clashing and have to reach both of them in that audience. A friend of mine that had taught with Jim many years ago, Tom Cronin, Chicago PD, was one of the early trained profilers. And he wound up being in charge of Chicago's academy. And we were talking, he hadn't been there about a month. He said, Stan, I'm watching an instructor and he's teaching surveillance. And he's got the folder. And he's going, okay, surveillance involving 2 officers on the street. So he had to watch reflection and so forth. Okay, he turns the page. Surveillance following a subject who has boarded a streetcar. Streetcar lines, even numbers go east-west, and everybody's looking at the room going, streetcars? We still have streetcars? That's how far outdated the material was. An instructor was just teaching from a lesson plan that somebody else wrote. That's uncalled for. If the instructor's not up to speed, I do not like to teach anybody else's material. And you may have been asked to do that, and I've been asked a couple of times. No, I won't teach your material. I will create my own.
Right.
From my viewpoint, because then that's my thought process. That's where it came from, right?
Yeah. I'll teach a lot of different classes, but it's going to be my stuff. I'm going to bring it in. I'm going to do the research. I'm going to have it because those are my stories that I have to tell the class.
This class I was just in Stapleton, Alabama, and I mentioned that somewhere on one of the breaks. And one guy said, yeah, I said, I was in a class. The instructor talked about working this homicide and how he had worked this and done this and this. What he didn't know was the officer from Louisiana that was his case was in the room. And he went to the academy director and said, this guy's lying his butt off. He's telling my case. He never worked that case. He's telling my case in the room. They dismissed the instructor on the spot.
Well, good
gave
for them.
the guys a break for the rest of the day and brought a new instructor in for the topic.
Yeah, good for them. Yeah, I think that the challenges as an instructor and as a trainer, and you brought this up, staying current, I think is a big challenge. And that's been a fear. I taught so much while I was on the job that one of my fears of retiring is that I would not be doing it like I was, and how would that affect my training? But one of the things I found since then is I do so much reading about what's going on elsewhere in the United States that actually I think my skill sets have gotten broader than they were when I was teaching while on the job, because I was too focused on what was specifically happening to me.
I think I sent you the other day, because it was exactly what you were saying. And I can't remember who to give credit to the attribution, fault at that. But successful people spend at least 1 hour a day reading. And that was what I would recommend. You get home, you're tired, whatever, but to spend an hour, even if it's just some type of literature, a short article, or listening to a blog or whatever, keeping engaged in your topic. And so that, because you and I are so committed to what we do, that's second nature to us. We see, when I saw that thing on the Eitelenberg or whatever phenomena, I knew immediately I had to get that to you. That
Right.
article.
Yes. Yeah.
So that sometimes that reading, and I'll get asked, what do you think about Brad Pitt and Amy Heard? Jeez, here we go.
That's not what I'm reading.
Yeah, no,
that's not what I'm
I
paying
said.
a lot of attention to.
I think it's two people to deserve each other. Okay, next question.
Next question. I want to go back and talk
Sure.
a little bit about the younger people that are in your classes, because one of the things that I've noticed, and this isn't an immediate problem, it's actually been happening for a while now, but a lot of the younger officers that we were trying to train and hire under our department they were decent in a lot of ways. They had good physical skills. They had very good intellectual skills. They were good at problem solving. What they couldn't do was talk to people. Their interpersonal skills were so degraded. We saw a lot of problems just having them ask basic questions, not even a real interview, just, hey, what happened, was almost impossible for them to do. Have you been seeing that as well, or that kind of problem?
Yeah, and I'm thinking even back at the beginning, there's some officers that stand out do good at collecting evidence and fingerprints and processing scenes. I was never good at maintaining the conversation. So one of the best ways to maintain a conversation is ask questions, sit back and listen. And instead of trying to be in charge and direct the whole conversation, throw out a good question like a Jay Leno and listen to the response and feed off of that. And that it validates the person you're talking to, that what they're saying and their experience is important to them. So once you get that, they go, oh, that'd be cool. And then I have plenty of video. For example, here's a guy that's using a very accusatory, guilt presumptive style. And you can tell that because he's contaminating. He's given I'll show one video and I ask the students, okay, who brings up where the wounds were in the uncle first in the room? And they'll listen. So the investigator brought it up. So how do we know that it's actually that, or did the investigator feed it? So they realize I can be quiet, ask open-ended questions, and still have a very fruitful conversation. I don't have to be the master of dialogue like a Jay Leno. Just make that other person the center stage and let them work it out themselves. Then follow up with questions that are incomplete or topics that are incomplete.
Asking cops not to be in charge is a little rough, though.
It is, and that's a challenge because we want them to be in control and charge on the scene and safety issues. Then you got to shift that gear and walk off out the hallway into the room and change the dynamic of who you are, is in control versus conversation and dialogue.
I'm curious with the younger generations and their difficulty in their interpersonal skills, they excel in the communication through non-traditional means, or actually it's becoming more traditional means with the computers, with text messages and those types of things. Have you seen is there any studies, or you've got any information about these types of interview and interrogation techniques being done over computers, whether it be through Zoom or whether it be through a text message or email?
I'm sure there's some, can't pin them down exactly in my head, that I've passed through. Had people ask me, can you interview over a telephone interview? I can see it being done, but there's something about being live and being there. And the bulk of deception and the cues are really on the mental side, which should come across through a Zoom call. For example, parodies. Those are the guys that have the shops in the airports with the bookstores and so forth.
Right.
Parodies.
Yes. Yeah.
And boy, those guys, the one guy I talked to in Texas, he had the whole central United States. He had all those airports, like from Texas, just straight up. And he said that's how, a lot of times to save money, he would interview through a chat room. I said, are you recording it, first of all? And do you have a visual? And is the employee in a place where other people are hearing, or is the supervisor standing in the corner? That kind of stuff, which then contaminates the subject's behavior, their demeanor. So we don't know what's going on in the background. If we could control those, I don't see why we couldn't be successful. But we don't know what's going on in the background off camera screen that we can't see. Or one of the things about doing the interview first, then doing a recap in an interview, which is not the forensic standard, but it's been still going on. We don't know what happened before the camera turned on. Were there threats made? Were there bargains made? Were there contamination going on? Then you hear the interviewer say, tell me what I want to hear. Then, okay, we've got a problem somewhere. But it should be viable, I think. But at the moment, I can't dig in my head that I've seen that's a good one. I'll have to dig that out. If there is any signal loss, if you will.
Obviously, you're going to lose those visual cues. So much of communication is nonverbal. What do you pick up from within the computer system? Is there any cues there that can use, or you do not have any of that? I think that's pretty interesting, especially with technology taking us where we are.
Where I pick up now, the big shift has been away from the body language because it's been so misused, and there's a lot of preconception or confirmation bias on the interviewer's part, where the verbal cues, the cognitive, has found there's lie signs are very faint and they're rare. But once you find that verbal mistake or that verbal comment and zero in on it, it really stands out. So it's less work on the interviewer and more productive. Now, that you still got to read the body for emotional feedback, etc. That's still critical. But it's reading the body language is really labor intensive. And I don't remember if prior to you and I being together that first time, if I'd finished the research project we did at John Jay College. And we worked with NYPD, State Department, Defense Department, Intelligence Agency, and 3 boroughs. And we found for every 2 minutes of tape, like talking to a homicide case where the NYPD was interviewing, they taped it. For every 2 minutes of tape, it took 1 hour to analyze all of a person's behaviors in 2 minutes.
Wow.
Of that time, 45 minutes was spent diagnosing body language. Only 15 minutes was used to diagnose speech. And the verbal cues were always more valuable, more accurate than the body language.
Now, what kind of verbal cues are you looking for?
There's a phenomenon called cognitive dissonance. Think of multitasking in your head. And the brain doesn't like lots of tracks going on. So here's my lie, but here's the truth. And it overloads the brain trying to bounce back and forth between those two. And you'll get drops in speech. They'll use the wrong words. The 3 most common areas where subjects tend to deceive is people, places, and time. For example, I use a tape, and alleged victim says at one point in time he laid the weapon down. That's one of those markers. The next thing you knew, all of a sudden, out of nowhere. All right, think of a traffic stop. How you doing today, sir? Fine. Where you headed? Into town. What for? See my friend. What's his name? Tom. What's Tom's last name? Don't know. How do you know him? They called him Skeeter. Where does he live? I can find his house. Get out of the car. I need to talk to you. Because how he's vague on where he's going,
right,
who he's meeting. When I go into other countries, that's the dialogue I have with their immigration people before they let me into the country. Who are you working with? Where are you staying? Is it business or pleasure? What are you going to do for pleasure? What's the hotel? What's your expertise? And they'll grill me of all that stuff before I'm allowed to pass through immigration into Germany, into Netherlands, and Canada's really big on that. And so they'll quiz you on your intent. Oh, and that too, Steve. These cues that we teach also work when you ask a person about their intent. Not what they've already done, but what they are thinking or planning of doing. For example, let's take a school shooting and somebody suspects that little Tommy is going to come to school with a gun, and a counselor intervenes. Hey, Tommy, what's going on? Tommy, have you thought about coming in here prior to today and shooting the place up? Or have you thought about harming students prior to today? Watch the change. Because the Secret Service study shows us they've thought about it many times before actually doing it. So it's a good interaction with them to stop them. What are you thinking? What are you planning? Such as, have you thought of harming yourself? When we talk to suicidal officers, for example. And we can get that same intent signals as we would if, say, they already committed the act.
That's absolutely fascinating. And it's a lot of what your classes are about, looking at things a different way, which again, I found so helpful even early in my career. And I used bits and pieces of it, if not all. I'd love to say I used all of it, how cops are, right? Using bits and pieces of it throughout my career. And I would always go back to that. Like I said, this has been very fascinating. Is there anything you'd like to end the conversation on? Anything you'd like to share with the listeners out there to help make your final point?
Your comment there about bits and pieces made me think of a couple of things. I'm also a Krav Maga instructor working up my level. And there was two things that stuck in my head where you were just talking. The triggers. One of the things we tell students, we give you all of these different defensive tactics and combative tactics, etc. Will you ever use all of them on the street? Nope. But you will have some that you're very good at. And those are the ones you use. If it works for you, then it's worked. But you don't have to do it exactly as we had it in class. But you're going to find there's a set of tools that you're very efficient at. The other one that mentioned is something's got to change. And a friend of mine, my Krav instructor, has a buddy who was Delta Force. And his job during the Iraq War, he was by himself, and he would track down really evil human beings, and he would take them out. And they were talking about the training and what he did. He doesn't share very much often. And he said, I had this one guy, and this Delta guy, he's a gorilla. He could whip a grizzly bear with a fly swatter kind of guy. And he said, I got entangled with this guy, and he was beating my butt. And he said, I thought I was going to die. And I decided something had to change. And that phrase stuck with us as instructors in the classroom. When you're stuck in a situation, self-defense situation, and you can't make any moves or you can't break out of it, change what you're doing. So the message I would have for the agencies, we've got this retrained police and so forth. If what we're doing is not being successful or as successful as it used to, we need to change something and do it differently. So this guy, Delta Force guy, the bad guy had him in the face, and his finger went into the Delta Force guy's mouth. And he changed things. He bit the guy's finger off and sent him off to meet the virgins in heaven. But at the point, he was about to lose his life. And he had to change something to change the situation we're in. So the message I give to law enforcement, maybe I know a lot of the complaints are invalid, a lot of it just noise, and we're under the microscope, and you can find anything wrong with anybody under a microscope. That doesn't mean that we aren't getting the job done. Maybe we change the way how we do it and improve those methods and progress as the instructor, the trainer, and as a law enforcement profession.
Stan, thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thanks for taking the time, and we'll have to get that coffee sometime.
It sounds like a plan. You get to meet me at the airport up in Indy.
You bet. We'll do.
Or Jim's office.
You got it.
Thanks, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.